Inventing Reality. Section: A Favored Few. The pattern of media ownership shows a high degree of concentration. 8 corporations control the 3 major television networks: CBS, NBC, ABC, some 40 subsidiary television stations, over 200 cable TV systems, over 60 radio stations, 59 magazines, including Times and Newsweek, chains of newspapers, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, and Washington Post, 41 book publishers, and various other media enterprises. The 3 major networks garner over 80% of all television advertising intended for a national audience. Of all the existing TV and radio stations, 80% are network affiliates. 6 corporations earn most of the revenues in the publishing world. 4 major studios control most of the box office gross on Hollywood films. 8 studios account for about 90% of U.S. feature film video rentals. 5 conglomerates own 95% of the music industry. During the 1980s, the media industry was one of the business world's most active sectors when it came to multi-million-dollar mergers and acquisitions. In that decade, the number of corporations dominating all media shrank from 46 to 23. In 1981, there were 20 dominant firms in the magazine industry. By 1990, a few corporations, Time Warner, News Corp, Times Mirror, and Hearst, controlled the lion's share of magazine circulation. Giant newspaper chains like Gannett, Knight Ridder, and Newhouse are gobbling up independent dailies at the rate of 50 or 60 a year, and earn about 75% of all newspaper revenues in the country. Less than 4% of U.S. cities now have competing daily newspapers under separate ownership. Through mergers, packaged news services, union busting, wage freezes, and staff cutting, the large media conglomerates have attained a rate of return on their investment that is double the industrial average. Consider the Hearst Corporation, whose empire includes scores of newspapers, magazines, television and radio stations, syndication productions, including King Features and Cowell Syndicate, and interests in cable stations and cable networks, real estate, printing, cattle ranching, and other businesses. In 1987, Hearst showed debt-free assets of $3.44 billion. Of the $215 million in profits made that year, $40 million were distributed to a relatively small group of William Randolph Hearst's living descendants, and the rest went for capital spending and acquisitions. The Hearst empire is easily matched by Times Mirror, with its 20 newspapers and magazines, 50 cable TV stations, television stations and publishing houses, and $3.5 billion in revenues and $298 million in profits in 1989. Then there is Gannett Company, with 84 daily newspapers, 16 radio stations, 10 television stations, and $3.3 billion in revenues, with net profits of $364 million in 1989. The Rupert Murdoch Empire, News Corporation Ltd., owns over 150 newspapers and magazines, 8 book publishing houses, including HarperCollins, a television network, Fox Broadcasting Company, satellite cable systems, and a major movie studio, 20th Century Fox. Murdoch has substantial media holdings on 3 continents, including 67% of the newspaper circulation in Australia. During the 1991 recession, however, Murdoch's expansionism threatened to undo him. having borrowed some $8 billion to finance his acquisitions. He was having trouble meeting his debt payments. Usually he could come up with money by profitably selling off a few properties. But during the recession that offered few buyers and almost no lenders, Murdoch found himself in financial trouble. The buyout of Warner Communications by Time Inc. created Time Warner, the largest of all media conglomerates, with assets estimated somewhere between $25 billion and $30 billion in the magazine, book publishing, and movie industries. It also created an $11 billion debt and a financial crisis for Time Warner during the 1991 recession that was not unlike the one faced by Murdoch. Subsection: Global Media. Development and manufacture of the world's communications equipment are concentrated in the hands of a few giant transnational conglomerates, the biggest companies of the West's military-industrial complex. They own most of the radio stations, printing factories, and television systems built in the world, and they produce more than 90% of the television sets and almost 80% of all radio sets sold abroad. This corporate grip on the means of communication is matched by a similar control over the information that has flooded the world. The Associated Press, AP, and United Press International, UPI, the two biggest U.S. news agencies, alone transmit more than 8 million words a day, while the 7 biggest news agencies in developing countries together produce only a tiny fraction of that amount. In many third world countries, the U.S. and its closest allies control up to 90% of the news flow. As the Indian journalist A. Raghavan said, quote, "The developing countries that have freed themselves from colonial political dependence are still saddled with information dependence." End quote. As electronics and the use of computers develop, this dependence increases. Assisting in this, quote, information imperialism are the U.S. State Department, the Pentagon, the CIA, the USIA, and the Voice of America, all of whom deluge the earth with their own peculiar brand of, quote, information. Adapted from E. Baskaskov, Empire of Lies and Deception, from the Democratic Journalist, October 1987. End of subsection. While conservatives from Spiro Agnew to George Bush have denounced the press for its supposedly, quote, liberal bias, they have never sought stricter regulations on ownership, advertising rates, and profits. Presidents like Nixon and Reagan imposed serious restrictions on freedom of information, yet supported corporate takeovers and profiteering in the media industry. In 1985, the Federal Communications Commission even set up new rules, allowing greater concentration of ownership in television and radio. The end result of all this concentration is that market-dominant media corporations make a higher percentage of profit on every dollar than do smaller competitors. It is not that they have superior quality, just superior reach and more economic muscle. Needless to say, the social and political implications of big profits and giant media mergers are subjects not critically treated by the news commentators who work for these conglomerates. End section.